turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turn it up.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, listeners.
We made it, man. I can't believe we finally got to this moment. This is really exciting.
This is a huge moment. Huge moment for you personally,
Yes.
for our friendship. Dare I say it, even me.
Yeah, I would say that it is a pretty big moment in your life. So congratulations. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and my co-host with me today is none other than Dylan Marsh.
Yeah.
Say something to the friends at
names.
home.
Well, the last name's out there. There's no hiding anymore. Yeah.
There's plenty of Dylan Marshes out there. No one knows it's you.
Yeah, I mean, thousands. So, yeah, I'm happy to be here. It's been a long time coming. We've put a lot of thought into doing something like this, and now we've actually put a little bit of behavior into doing it.
I know. I kind of feel like being like, hey, we're making a podcast. It's almost kind of like an embarrassing thing to kind of tell people. But you know what? We've been talking about it for a long time, and I really think we found the right niche that we can actually contribute valuable content to, as opposed to just rambling about nothing.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely would never try to make a podcast where we ramble about nothing.
No, not us. Never. So no one knows who we are. So just right off the bat, have you done the math on how long we've known each other for? I think we were neighbors like 20 years ago. Like second grade, we were neighbors. This is like living down the street from each other, which I didn't realize I'd have known someone for that long. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's been a long haul. I would say, so we've probably known each other since then. I would say I was actually a little closer to your brother, Chris, at first than I was to you.
Yeah.
And since you guys are twins, actually, I got closer to you, Charles, later on.
Like, but 5-6 years later.
Yeah. A key moment for our friendship, though, was when I was in fourth grade, my birthday party. I was having at one of these arcades, and then I was going to invite Chris, but I wasn't going to invite you because we didn't know each other that well. It wasn't a personal thing where I disliked you. I just didn't know that guy Charles too well. And then your mom called my mom, and she said, you can't invite Chris without inviting Charles. Wow. So you got the big invite to my fourth grade birthday party. Got to play some free games. And
always nice when your mom calls for you. So that's how I've achieved a lot of success in my early education. So
yeah, I figured.
Yeah, well, we had a good run for sure, and in high school we hung out even more, I would say, and college as well. It wasn't until like the past 5 years maybe that we moved into separate states, which explains why we're recording this remotely now. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and Marsh is way over in the state of Colorado. So we just figured out the technology to do this. We're not pros, so if there's any issues, too bad. We're still learning, but we're trying our best.
I like how you went defensive there instead of saying,
well, I just know it's not going to be perfect. We're trying.
I thought you were going to be like, let us know and we'll try to make changes, and you really lashed
that
out.
Stuff too. Let us know, but also don't get too upset because we are trying. So
I can take it. Send the hate mail about the technological issues to me,
and we'll figure out how to get hate mail set up. That's on the to-do list. So we'll get that going. So yeah, we've been friends for a while, and I'd say what's unique about my friendship with you, at least, is that there's not too many people I know that I can talk to extensively about fantasy books and fantasy series. Definitely not to the extent that we talk about them. And after all these years of like sitting around having these long conversations, like, man, I wish we like had recorded some of these, because I really feel like we made some really great points that no one's really talking about in the greater world of fantasy criticism.
Yeah, I would agree. I'll say that I don't I don't know. There's not really many people that I interact with on a day-to-day basis that I feel I can talk fantasy with. And it gets to the point where, since we don't live that close anymore, when we do talk, I almost feel starved for
Right.
fantasy connection.
I know. And it's
And
one of those things where it's like, I love Harry Potter, I love Game of Thrones, I love Lord of the Rings. Those are all some of my favorites. But, who do I turn to talk to about Brandon Sanderson or Joe Abercrombie or, the latest fantasy book? Like, that's a very, very limited group of people. And you are definitely at the top of that list. So definitely makes sense that we're doing this now.
yeah, I appreciate it, and I definitely feel the same about you, Charles. I almost feel I am really eager to just vomit all my fantasy novel takes all over you when we do get the chance to talk. So I hope more consistency will mean
Yes.
that we can be more composed when we're
Yes, and
chatting.
that's something that you guys can look forward to. We're just going to be vomiting all over each other, all
Hmm.
kinds of good, chunky
Yeah,
material
getting
here
there
that
with the
we're
imagery.
working on. Yeah, yeah, it's going to be a lot. So, projectile, if you will, is something you can expect from us in the future. And that's the whole point of this. We just wanted an outlet to have
Vomit?
fun. Yes, to vomit metaphorically to each other, back and forth repeatedly, um,
Hmm.
on a regular basis. And it also kind of keeps us on our toes, keeps us current with what's coming out. We'll be trying to read all the latest stuff, but also cover a lot of the classics too of modern fantasy and yeah, we're just looking forward to having an outlet to just enjoy each other's company and focus the conversation on our love and appreciation of fantasy stories.
Yeah, nailed it, Charles.
Nailed it. I felt good
Hmm.
about that.
Yeah, I felt
So
really good about it.
that was great. I guess, how do you want to start this off? Did we do enough introduction? Should we just go to the next? Should we just talk about like fantasy stuff now?
Yeah, I mean, no one really cares who we are, probably.
Yeah, I mean, what else
Yeah,
is there to know? We're two friends, and we're gonna talk some fantasy. I mean, you get the gist of it.
yeah. I mean, they probably could have figured that out by the title. It's amazing that we've probably droned on for like 10 minutes to just get across what they learned reading the title.
That's true. So let's we got the friend part down. Let's start to roll in some of the fantasy elements of the show.
Yeah.
So I guess what we should first talk about. One of the things we decided we wanted to talk about was just to kind of kick things off was what got us interested in the world of like fantasy books, stories, series, things like that. And I couldn't think of a better way to start than to share your experiences of when you first were like, I am a fan of these fantasy like stories. I need more. I gotta get more of that because I don't think I really know this about you. I have my guesses, but I'm curious to see what you're gonna say.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what you say too, but I'll get started. I'll say I was relatively late to the fantasy game. I started to really get into it when I was in college. We're both in our late 20s now.
Mhm.
Charles in his especially late 20s.
Well,
And yeah, and then I I would say some of my, when I was a kid, I did read some Harry Potter and things like that, but I was not like a fantasy fan. I'd say I started to really get into it when I started watching Game of Thrones, which is probably the most common way, I would
That's
guess.
what I thought, because I kind of remember that moment when, not to speak for you, but I do remember because we were hanging out a lot this one summer, and I remember very vividly you were starting to watch Game of Thrones, and you then binged what was there, and then read through the books, and I was like, okay, this is good. I'm excited that this kind of fantasy world is getting adopted by you, because I'd been pushing Game of Thrones on people for years and years. So I was glad that you could be someone else to kind of jump on that train. That was a great time to be a Game of Thrones fan.
It really was.
Peak magic.
I believe I got into Game of Thrones between the 3rd and 4th season, which was just an absolutely amazing time to start watching that show. And so I pretty much got to the Red Wedding and then that one episode after it, and then pretty soon the 4th season was coming up, and
that's awesome.
I mean, it was incredible. So I'd say that I think I didn't really notice that I think I kind of always had liked fantasy stuff, especially like the medieval type setting, and I actually really liked Final Fantasy IX, which I played before I got into Game of Thrones, and I was like, this is really, really cool, and that's got an interesting balance between fantasy and almost steampunk type setting. And I think though Game of Thrones was the big one that turned me on to it, and then I also want to give a shout out to the Catherine Voyage series. Was I think the second fantasy series that I read. That's by Robert V.S. Reddick. And
I don't think I've read that.
No, I bring that up every once in a while, but I never super hard push it on anyone, because I think after reading some of the Game of Thrones books, I was like, I should try something different. And you remember we used to go to that. We should probably plug that site, but I can't remember.
Yeah, plug it to our zero listeners. But no, that was a driving force for me for a while. I was like the friend. I don't want to topfantasy.com. I don't know. You look up, you type best fantasy series into Google. It's like one of the first ones that comes up.
Yeah,
which is how we found it.
Yeah. So I'd go there, and this Catherine Voyage series wasn't in the elite tier, but it said something about how Game of Thrones fans would like it. So I was in. And then I remember, I think this was actually, because if I picked up a bad book after Game of Thrones, I think I could have very easily been one of those people who's like, I like fantasy because I like Game of Thrones and I've watched the Lord of the Rings movies, but not go any further than that. But that I read a series that no one had really heard of, and I was just enamored with it. I was reading hundreds of pages every day, and I finished, there's 4 books in that series, and I finished it in probably a couple weeks. And my reading habits don't look anything like that anymore, but I just felt like I was in that world. And I love those books. It's hard to know how they would age. I think some of it was like, now I look back and I can see some things that were a little tropey that felt new to me though. And at the same time, I think they're good books, and I definitely recommend them.
Yeah. That's on my hit list. I gotta check those out, because I've never, you've brought it up a couple times now in conversation, and I always forget that was like one of those early influences for you. I should definitely read that. My story starts a little earlier. It was definitely when I was in like elementary school. Both of my parents are like super avid readers, and I remember very clearly my mother was the first one to mention Harry Potter. Like when the first book was like coming out, she's like, "Oh, you're gonna like this book. It's called Harry Potter." I'm like, "Whatever," and then it like exploded. So I was always like, "Okay, she's on the front of it." So I read all those books growing up. I'd say in my younger years I was reading those like young adult books, and I was trying to think of like the ones that really shaped my kind of interest in fantasy series, and the two that came up for me was The Giver, which I would consider fantasy. A lot of kids have to read it in school, and I just remember reading it when I was really young, and that was kind of my first exposure to all those young adult novel tropes, like the whole idea of a utopian society, and then like the kid who gets all this greater knowledge and like kind of rebels against it, and that was like a really powerful book for me. I would read
Wow.
that multiple times.
Huh.
It was
I
just
think
really
I
interesting.
used Spark Notes on that one.
It's worth a read. I mean, I don't know if it's gonna be worth it now. It's like such a like it's a really light, quick read, and you might just be like, yeah, whatever. This is obviously for kids, but at the time, it was really cool. Another one that I remember, I don't remember anything about the story at all. I don't even remember a single main character, but I remember almost all the book covers was for this young adult fantasy series called Deltora Quest. Have you ever heard of that?
Not at all.
It was like maybe 10 really short, chapter books. It was a fantasy series about this troop that were trying to get gems to fill out a belt, and at the end of each book they would get a gem, and then the last one completed the belt, and I guess they beat the bad guy. I honestly don't remember, but I remember the books. They had, I remember the covers were badass, and I was like googling them in preparation for this episode, and I was like, oh my god, I remember all of these were so sick. And apparently it was also like an anime that aired on Cartoon Network like 5 years ago or something. I don't know, but
Hmm.
those were the two early ones. Like I also read The Hobbit, but I would say another like Renaissance, I'm all in fantasy moment for me was the Lord of the Rings movies. By far, and I know that's like a really like bandwagony basic person thing to say, but I love those movies so much. I watch them once a year for the past like how many years has it been now? Like 15 years. They're so good, and I've just was always like enraptured by them, and I immediately read The Hobbit and all of those books, and that's what got me into Game of Thrones actually, because I
Yeah.
saw the commercial and I saw Sean Bean in it, and I was like, okay, they're basically telling me, hey, Lord of the Rings fans, watch this because
Mhm.
we've even got Lord of the Rings people in it. And so that's how I got into it. I watched it as season one was airing. I was watching it. I had no idea what it was. I'd never heard of Game of Thrones, and it like that also blew my mind. Like by the end of the first season, my mind was totally blown. I was like, this is like fantastic. This is like Lord of the Rings, but like really like so much more down to earth and like intense and just awesome. And I was in love with it. So that's kind of what kicked off my whole love of fantasy for me. And then from there, it was just going reading all those, going to that website to googling the best fantasy series, reading through all of them, just absorbing all of that material, and it's no looking back since for sure. That's kind of my early introduction to the world of fantasy.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. I knew the Lord of the Rings movies were going to come up for you,
Oh,
and
for
you
sure.
actually were the one to first show me all the Lord of the Rings movies right before our New Zealand trip,
Right.
so I could know where we
I
were
think we should
going.
have mentioned at the top that not only have we known each other for over 20 years, but we also climbed Mount Doom together.
That's true.
Like we made that pilgrimage. We went halfway around the world and we fucking climbed Mount Doom. We did that. So if that adds to our street cred, which it should, that's just another example of how deep this connection goes between our fantasy friendship, as they say.
Yeah, and no joke, you almost died
I
on that.
did almost die. That might be a conversation for another day. But what happened was people were just like the people above you. If they loosed a rock, the hill was so steep
Don't spoil it.
that yeah, I almost got killed by a rock. But we can tell the story later. We can tell the story later. I am a fine, but at the time it was scary. but that's another day. You don't just, as you know from the movies, you don't just casually stroll up to the top. One does not simply walk into Mordor and climb to the top of the mountain. You have to put in some sacrifice. So, yes, kudos to the Lord of the Rings and Sean Bean for getting me then into Game of Thrones. It was just very interesting how it all played out, and it was all calculated by HBO for me to do that. But it was great. It was a great idea by them to get me into the show and into fantasy.
Yeah. So were you reading fantasy between when the Lord of the Rings movies came out and then Game of Thrones premiered? Were you staying in touch with it?
I wasn't reading any of the modern fantasy stuff, but I was burning through a lot of the stuff in my parents' library. I was reading all the young adult stuff. So I was reading Harry Potter. Like, I was going to the midnight release parties at Barnes & Noble to get Harry Potter and read it. I read Del Toro Quest and Hobbit, and I read all the Lord of the Rings books, and I read, all these other stories, but nothing in the modern fantasy world. It wasn't until I read George and wanted more that I then read like Sanderson and Abercrombie and those guys. But I didn't get until that point until post Game of Thrones. But before that, I was reading like all the young adult stuff, and I read a ton of those books. But nothing really strong came to mind for me besides like The Hobbit and like The Giver. Those were two ones that I really enjoyed, and then all the other ones. I read a lot of science fiction also, but no, fantasy, as we are going to talk most about like the modern stuff, was all post season 1 of Game of Thrones. That was the big drive.
Yeah. I didn't know The Giver would get a shout out today. That was definitely a big surprise.
I know. I was thinking about it. I was like, I would consider that a fantasy book. And that was the first book that I read that I was like, okay, this is interesting. Like people with powers and like society, So it was, it was, because all these young adult books kind of hit the same tropes. But that was like, if that's the first one you're exposed to, you're like, whoa, this is like blowing my mind. But it's been written 1,000 million times before. But as a kid, when it's the first one, it can be pretty impactful.
So was that Mr. Borland or Mr. Bosley that turned you on to that one?
I think I was reading that well before them. That was like 7th grade. I was reading these books way earlier than that. I think it was like I remember in Borland we read some other, what's her name, Lois something, who wrote those books. I'm not an expert on these books, okay, but that we read other books by that author, and I remember being like, these are fine, but I just think like it was right timing, right place for The Giver for me to read it, to enjoy it. But I agree, Lois Lowry, yeah, I agree, that was a wild pick, but it's true. We're talking like first.
And people should know that our 7th grade English teacher, Mr. Borland, was in Sons of Elvis.
Yeah, we should give them a shout out too, I guess. We just did.
Yeah.
Sons of Elvis. If you like 90s, 90s grunge, I guess. Poppy grunge that never actually became poppy, like hipster 90s grunge, just like where it's at.
Is poppy grunge a genre?
I guess that's how I would describe it.
But well, people should look up Sons of Elvis and see that our English teacher was in a legit band. I think they had a song that charted.
They were on like some of Jimmy Stewart's late night shows. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
The guy from Comedy Central?
That's Jon Stewart.
Jon Stewart. Okay, yeah, he was on Jon Stewart's late night show a couple times.
Wow.
I've seen the YouTube clips.
Me too.
Just to get a sense of what formed our literary futures, the kind of people that were involved. He was the lead singer was one of them. So
yeah,
shout out to him and that band.
Yep. So one of the things that I wanted to make sure we chat about that I was thinking about when we came up with this topic was we said what got you interested in fantasy. I'm kind of interested in what is it about fantasy that interests you?
That's a good question, and I've thought about that. Like I know lots of people in my life who like read almost exclusively like nonfiction and articles and stuff. And for me, I can't really be bothered. I just love the idea of like taking elements of humanity and characteristics and actual characters and putting them in these fantastic stories, taking elements of society and like using things like dragons and magic to exponentially increase the stakes of it. I just find I get a lot of value out of all the themes of fantasy and the whole idea of just these completely new worlds that you can really sink your teeth into. And as someone who's read books like nonstop and who's like seen like every movie and played tons of video games, just like reading every story, fantasy is one of those few genres you can just really sink your teeth into. It's like, hey, you like these characters? Well, buckle up, because it's like a 7-book series that's thousands and thousands of pages long, and it only builds and gets bigger, and the characters change over time. And for me, there's nothing like that in any other genre or style of writing. I think fantasy does that best. Real character and story that you can really dig your teeth into. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, as you're talking about that, I was like, oh no, he's going to say the same thing I was thinking, which, yeah, and we've never really talked about this before, and that's why I wasn't prepared to have a very different answer than you, but I was thinking about it too, and what came up big for me was that idea of telling stories that are still about humans and human nature. I have a psychology background, and
That's right.
yeah,
It's good we mentioned
so
that. Some of your
yeah,
credibility.
yeah, and I am super interested in people and human nature and questions about that, and I feel like that the stories I liked and still do like best in fantasy, they're still about people and human nature, but you can put those people in scenarios that you could never in our reality. And by
Right, they're
doing
not
that, you
bogged
can.
down by like the BS of like, oh, why didn't they just call him on the cell phone or whatever? It's like in this world, this is how society's structured, and that kind of shapes stories. And it's interesting to see how different characters, different psychoses, kind of navigate those elements of the world and the magic systems and all of those things. It's really interesting to see. And every book is so
Exactly.
different.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things that, and it's not just that people can't call each other on cell phones and stuff. It's the limitations, but also the things you can add to the story. So I was thinking, what are good examples like this? And I was thinking we've got a Mistborn episode coming up. So, and
Ooh.
yeah, there's a tease. Yeah. So then I was thinking in Mistborn that you have this character, the Lord Ruler, who is basically a force of nature, like a considered a god, but almost the way that they speak about him in the book, it's like you can't stop. There's a great quote, but I don't have it. I remember that's like you can't stop the Lord Ruler. He's like the winds or the mists, because mists are just part of the nature in that world too. So seeing him as something even just like the wind or the sun, where he's still a person, but he's also a force. So you've got this thing where characters can want vengeance against him, because you can't really want vengeance against the wind, but he still has the gravitas of being a force of nature. I'm like, that's really cool.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And then you also have moments like in another Sanderson book I read where you where you have a character who he is a god, but he was a man originally, and he kind of still has memories of being a man, and he doesn't believe in himself as a god. So you can kind of like that's, and the character's written in such a way where it's like you could empathize with him of being like, this is all kind of BS. Like, I'm not really a god. I don't have any magic powers. I'm just the guy who, by sheer chance, got put in the situation where I'm now worshipped as a god, and like I feel kind of like a fraud. And that's kind of that psychosis that you can really get into. It's a really interesting hypothetical kind of thought experiment that is what makes fantasy like a really interesting read when you find the right author and the right story.
Yeah, I mean, the god with self-esteem issues is, I mean, that's straight out of the Brandon Sanderson world building generator. And I say that lovingly. And I mean, things you can explore with that, I mean, you can explore self-esteem issues or whatever in
the context of
nonfiction
this
or,
fantastical elements. And
yeah.
and when they're grounded in this kind of reality like Mistborn is, there's like a I don't want to talk too much about Mistborn, but the magic system is very rooted in almost like a scientific theory, and it brings it's those kind of elements you like in science fiction and fantasy you can't really get in like a James Patterson detective novel, which those are good, but it's, for me, it's just I want a little more meat on the bones. I want to really dive into a character, and I really love these crazy situations they get into in fantasy stories that you can't get into anywhere else.
Yeah, Patterson taking a shot out of nowhere.
I mean, I've read a couple. They're fine. My dad loves them. He reads them all. He's probably read all of them. But for me, it's like, come on, how many like super cool action heroes can you write before you need to move on to something else? At least for me.
Yeah.
So should we talk? You can finish that thought, but I do want to talk about our gateway fantasy discussion.
I do want to get into the gateway fantasy discussion
because we've talked about like our gateway kind of experiences, but that was kind of more into the world of fantasy as a whole. But what I really wanted to get into was our discussion of like gateway fantasy into like from when we went from Game of Thrones to blowing through all those other fantasy series. And I was curious because I think I know what you're going to say. I think you know what I'm going to say. But I would be very interested for you to go first to kind of say what if someone wanted to go from like, hey, I loved Harry Potter, I loved Game of Thrones, most of it. I kind of want to dabble more into the nitty gritty of modern fantasy. Like, what directions would you point me in?
Yeah, well, I realize now that we might be doing our Mistborn show a little early, but that's my
right.
That's my recommendation that I always give out, and it's not that Mistborn is just what I think the best book of all time or anything like that. But I love it. I see it as a litmus test almost, where if you read Mistborn and you don't like it, I mean, of course you can try more, but I feel okay that you might be able to say, hey, maybe I'm just not into fantasy. And
right.
If you read Mistborn and you do like it, it's got a lot of what you'll be seeing in modern fantasy, I think, and it's got that hard magic system, which maybe we'll get into the
right.
hard,
That's a whole
soft magic
discussion.
system distinction when we have our Mistborn episode. But it's got a lot of, I think, what you'll be seeing while still having enough of a twist to it to not feel like what I see as old school high fantasy, which would be something like going as far back as Lord of the Rings, but even something like Wheel of Time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you come out Mistborn and you don't like it, maybe I'll have a specific recommendation for you, getting a sense of what you do and don't like. But I also think, okay, we might be finding this person's not a fantasy fan.
Right.
And I also want to mention, I do want to mention that I try to give specific recommendations to people based on if I do know them pretty well, what I think they'd like. So my first recommendation to
Yes,
our close mutual friend Evan's Dr. Evan.
Dr. Evan.
Yeah. Uh, I recommended that he read The Magicians first by Lev Grossman. And the reason I recommended that was because he was in medical school at the time. And I was hearing his stories about just spending all day studying and how stressful it was and how just worn down he was by it. And it sounded so much like what Quentin and the others
Did
said.
he? Did Evan read the Magicians trilogy?
He did. He
Did he
read the
like it?
first book. Yeah, he liked the first. He didn't read the second book, but he read the first book, and I think it actually did really resonate with him because of how they make magic into something that you get ridiculously smart people to study just a preposterous amount, and then maybe they can do really minor stuff. And I think that made sense to him as someone who was in medical school.
Mhm. And like we're talking about Mistborn, and look, it's no coincidence that the next episode we're going to do is probably going to be a discussion on Mistborn because both of us share that similar philosophy in that Mistborn is kind of a great um, foundation level to kind of get a sense of what you like and don't like about fantasy. And for those that don't know, Mistborn is a really popular trilogy. It's 3 books by an author named Brandon Sanderson, who's a very prolific author in modern fantasy. And he actually recently, in the past couple of years, signed like a multi-million-dollar movie deal. We'll see what comes of that. But he is one of the more prolific and certainly respected and certainly best-selling authors of modern fantasy. He also wrote the last couple books of Wheel of Time, which anyone who knows that, it's no news. And anyone who doesn't know what Wheel of Time is, it doesn't matter. So moving on from that, Mistborn was my obvious first choice too. I knew you were going to say it. You knew I was going to say it. And I, for pretty much exactly the same points, like in terms of like sword and sorcery, modern fantasy, Mistborn is just a really great, rock solid example of that. It's not too hard to read. Like he doesn't use a lot of heavy vocabulary. He doesn't get too nitty gritty in descriptions. It's very, very readable. It's not like you're jumping from a Game of Thrones Harry Potter into like even something like Lord of the Rings, which has very flowery prose, and or something like Malazan, which is super intense. It's like, look, this is almost like a movie in how it reads. It's got lots of action. The characters are very movie star like kind of qualities about them, and it's a really quick read. It's a really satisfying read. It's got great twists and turns. It's got a satisfying ending. It's like a pretty solid, like if you like swords and sorcery, you're probably going to like this. And if you don't, then there's very few fantasy books far enough removed from any of those themes that I would recommend. I don't think there would be much. So that's why I think we're both on the same page with Mistborn in that respect. And we will, we figured because it's our gateway story, that's going to be our gateway review. So that's something you can look forward to in the next episode. But yes, that's my gateway. The other one, which you also said, which is upsetting, is The Magicians. I love that series a lot. It's one of my favorites, and I always recommend it because when Harry Potter came out, we were the target demo, right? And then you talk to people now, and they're like 29, and they're like, "Oh, I love Harry Potter." I'm always like, well, have you read The Magicians? The Magicians is like Harry Potter for a 29-year-old. It's like Harry Potter for adults. It's a beautiful series. It has swords and sorcery elements, but it's a very modern, like it's totally removed from that. They're very different settings, Mistborn and Magicians, very different. So that's kind of why I have both of those in my back pocket as like ready to go. Hey, these are the two that you may not have heard about that are well established and really good, and two different kind of worlds of fantasy, and they're both really fantastic. And if you don't like either of those, then you're hopeless. I don't know what to tell you, but you at least should like one of them. I don't know. They're both really good, but at least one of them you should walk away with being like, that was worth my time to read, which is one of the highest praises I give a book these days.
Yeah. You said a lot. I really liked what you mentioned. I forgot to mention this about Mistborn, which is the satisfying ending, and I think it's so huge that when you are recommending a book that's a part of, I mean, most great fantasy books, not all, of course, are part of series. Mistborn is no exception there, but it totally works as a standalone. So if someone is the type of person where they'll finish the book, but they can know afterward, hey, maybe this isn't for me, I feel confident that they can depart after
Exactly.
reading
It's
Mistborn,
also good to mention that,
Final
like,
Empire.
look, it's not like 9 books with another 6 coming out that will take 20 years. It's like, no, it's 3 books. They came out years ago. It's done. They're like, there are other books in that world, but that story is done and it's established, and you can read those 3 books and never read anything else, and you'll have the whole picture. So that's another huge reason. Like, there's so many great series out now, but they're not finished. So it's like, hey, I don't want to recommend someone reads a 12-book series. It's like not like you're kind of tone deaf to people. People are like, what? Why did he recommend this thing that's going to take like a year to read when I could just, read something a lot faster and shorter? So that's why I also pick Mistborn and The Magicians for that. They're both 3 books. It's not like 2 crazy, like Harry Potter's longer, so I think it's a good start for anyone, even if you're not like a really strong reader, because they're finished and they're relatively shorter.
Yeah, and the prose is so straightforward.
Yes.
I know Sanderson speaks about prose in as being similar to a window, where what he wants is, look, you can have this really fancy window with like stained windows and things like that, or and those are really good looking and nice. But what Sanderson wants his prose to be is a very, very clear window through which you can see the story. And I think his prose really fits well with that, where I think you said it's like watching a movie. Sometimes
Right.
Mistborn, I feel like, is like playing a video game. And
It would be a great
it's
video
just,
game.
yeah. And it's just very, very easy to get absorbed into, because you actually, in some ways, are benefited by not having those moments where you're like, whoa, that's such a good turn of phrase, because while those moments are cool, they do remind you you're reading a book, and you're not going to get that from Sanderson. But there's also not going to be anything so bad in his prose that you have the other problem.
Right, because there's people out there who just will say, "Oh, Malazan's the best series ever," but I would no way recommend that be someone's first experience with fantasy, because it's so
Definitely not.
long and it's so demanding of the reader to kind of understand what's happening, that I don't want to sour people's tastes. And I mean, we both love. I don't want to take this from you, but we both love Abercrombie. And we'll have many episodes where we talk about him, but he's kind of like a fantasy writer's author. He's writing for people that have already read a lot of fantasy. So although it's like really like he twists the tropes and things, so it's one of those things where it's like, hey, he's great, but I wouldn't recommend him to start either, just because he's for when you're more familiar with fantasy tropes and the genre. But Mistborn, it's like, I just want to entertain the reader with a good story. That's kind of the whole point of this whole thing, and it delivers on that as far as I'm concerned, which is why I recommend it. And I mean, the same goes for The Magicians. It's a lot heavier, but it's still entertaining, but in a much different way. It's definitely more of a thought-provoking piece, but they're both good examples of concise stories with modern prose. It's designed to be very readable and serviceable, and it's no surprise that both of them have sold insanely well over the years. So highly recommend those as gateways, and I'm sure we'll cover both in the very near future of the show.
Yeah, I mean, that if I'm asked my favorite author, I usually jump to Joe Abercrombie, the author of the First Law trilogy and Age of Madness, which is his new continuation of that. And yeah, I totally agree with your points, though, about I would not think to recommend that as an early introduction into the fantasy genre, because you're not going to pick up on the things that he's subverting, and because of that you might even be disappointed, I would think, in some ways, where a veteran fantasy reader will say, oh, I can't believe he did that, that's amazing, I never saw that coming.
Right. So let's turn it back to the audience. All us fantasy fans out there, what would your gateway fantasy books be? Write that in the comments. Don't say Harry Potter. Don't say Game of Thrones. Don't say Lord of the Rings.
I love how you're alluding to some comment section that doesn't exist. Like, not just in the sense that that the podcast is just starting, so there's no comment section. It's like there's not a comment section to a podcast. Like, there's reviews.
We're gonna start a dialogue. Okay, we're gonna post to YouTube. It's happening. Yeah. This is for the YouTube audience, but for the people and other things, send us an email or something. I don't know if you're listening at all, which no one should be, but if someone is, let us know. At least just be like, hey, I listened to this. That alone would be really special to us. So
it would. And for the record, when you're saying no one should be, you mean yet, not in general, right?
Right. I think the content's good enough that people would listen to it and like it, but no one should be listening now because it's not created yet, and no one is going to listen to a series that only has one episode, all that kind of stuff. But you never know.
The true fans will.
The true fans will. So congratulations to the true fans. Leave comments about your gateway fantasy book recommendations.
And a 5-star review.
And download it on all your devices and tell your friends. And that's a great place to segue into our next conversation. What should we talk about next? Do you want to talk about what we're looking forward to? You want to skip ahead and just talk about that, or is there something else you want to
I'm up for that, yeah.
Okay, well, one of the things we wanted to kind of end on this introductory episode would just kind of be, what are we looking forward to in the world of fantasy books, fantasy movies, TVs, just fantasy stories in general. Marsh, have you put any thought into it? I'm curious to see what you're looking forward to.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I took this as like what things are going to be released in the future necessarily.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I took it as just broadly in my own interaction with the fantasy world.
Okay.
What am I looking forward to experiencing? Some of it is stuff that's coming out, and we've been talking a lot about Joe Abercrombie, and he has this new trilogy that picks up 30 years after his famous First Law series. I read the first book already, and right. I believe in September is when we can expect the second book in that trilogy.
When did the book you just read come out?
Last September. So
okay. So he's really cranking them out.
He's already written all of them.
Ah.
So they just have it on a release schedule. I think it's literally 1 year after the first.
I respect that.
Yeah.
Like
I
write
mean,
it all in the front and then control the release. That way you don't have someone reading the first one, like falling in love with it, and then waiting all these years to finish it.
yeah, I like it too. I mean, it's a luxury for someone who's had the kind of success that Abercrombie's had.
Sure.
I think a lot of these people need the paycheck, so they got to crank it out. But when you can write as quickly as Abercrombie can, and he's not as prolific as someone like Brandon Sanderson because no one is, and he is also someone though who gets the job done in a reasonable amount of time. So he was able to still have things moving, it seemed like, and get this out. And so I think that there's no reason why the books aren't just going to come out now last September, this upcoming September, and then the one after that. So I'm just super excited. And Charles, I do recommend, of course, a full First Law reread, including the standalones, before you dive in. But it's so good. I think I'd go so far as to maybe say better than the first book, The Blade itself, the first book of the original First Law series.
Wow.
Although, yeah, and I won't say any more than that. And then other stuff I'm looking forward to was stuff that I'm just looking forward to for me to do. One is getting to the part in the Malzahn books where it picks up.
Yeah, let me know when you find it. I don't want to upset any Malzahn fans out there, but we've both attempted to read it.
I haven't given
the
up.
Good fight. You're still fighting the good fight. I've kind of moved on to other things. I'll come back to it, but
yeah, you're gonna lose the only fans.
No, if you like Malzahn, please hear us out. You know, we're only 2 books in, okay? So we know all about how it switches around, and by the 3rd book or 4th book or whatever, it supposedly turns into the most amazing fantasy series of all time, okay? We're holding out for that. But
well, Charles, let me tell you what I really respect about Malzahn fans.
Lay it on me about what you feel about Malzahn fans.
That I respect them so much. And here's why. And I'm actually not joking about this part. I think that they're at least willing to acknowledge it's slow at first. And I think is a double-edged sword because to some extent it's like, okay, you're convincing me to read like 2,000 pages before you're telling me, oh, now it gets good. Where if they weren't saying that, I think if you're not really enjoying the first 2,000 pages you read of a series, you're almost definitely not even making it that far, but you're dropping it at least by that point. And I think, so I'm in the last 100 pages of the second book now.
Oh,
and
yeah, you passed me a while ago.
Yeah, a while ago. And I mean, I'm going to close it out. I'm going to start the 3rd book. There's nothing that's going to stop me, but I definitely see what I think a lot of the Malzahn fans acknowledge, which is at the start, it can be slow at times, and I'm honestly confused at times and forgetting characters and having to go back to that, what do they call it? Dramatis personae, is that how you pronounce it? The list of the characters and who they are. So I'm looking forward to this magical thing that all the Malzahn fans say happens, which is that it suddenly becomes the best thing I've ever read.
I do have respect for anyone that has read those first couple books and has a very strong idea of what's going on. Like if you are like super understanding of the lore of Malzahn, you have a higher reading ability than me, and I don't say that often, but that's one of those books that was definitely challenging me as a reader, like that I haven't been challenged like that in a long time. So mad props. But my fear, like, I'm sure it's gonna get good, but there's this little part of me that's like, is this Stockholm syndrome from the like really small percent of population that's read that much? I mean, it's sold a bunch of copies, it's been in print for forever, but I am almost afraid of people just like having to feel like it's good because they spend all this
Yeah.
time trying to figure it out, and they're like, "Wow, it's so complicated. I love it," and then they just kind of that whole inception moment of being like, it's complicated and cool. So I don't know. I'm afraid, but
Yeah.
I got to
Well,
see
in
what
psych,
it's all about.
In psych, we call that cognitive dissonance. It's basically that you engage in some sort of behavior, and because you already did something, like let's say read 3,000 pages of a book, you just start to believe based on that behavior that your beliefs actually align with the behavior you engaged in. So why would I read 3,000 pages of something I don't like? I must like it. So yeah, so that's
A possibility.
yeah. I don't want to say that's what's happening to Malzahn fans because
No, we won't know for sure until we've read it all.
well, we won't know for sure even after, but maybe we'll fall victim
We'll have
to
an
it too.
idea. Oh, that's true. That's true.
We're not immune.
But
But
I'm hoping
it's
with your psychology knowledge, we can identify when it's happening to us.
what's amazing about psychology knowledge is that how hard it still is to recognize these things. I definitely have moments where I'm like, oh my God, I'm getting my PhD in psychology. How am I not, how did I not notice that this was happening? And
How am I not more well adjusted by this point after all this psychology training?
I'm glad you said it.
Well, for me, let's see. In terms of books, I'm definitely looking forward to finishing out Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones. Like, let's get Winds of Winter out. Let's read it. Let's, get the next book out and let's finish it. Let's close it out. I have a strong feeling that the books are going to hit the same plot points that the story does, but it's going to be so much better. It's going to be super epic. I almost wish I hadn't seen that last season of television so that these twists and turns can play out in the books with the kind of space and attention they were meant to have. But this Game of Thrones was a great series, but I'm looking forward to the meat of the books in that respect. So that's top of the list, and I'm sure we're gonna have a whole Game of Thrones discussion in the future. So we'll table that. But Winds of Winter, I'm ready. Let's do it. George's had enough time to write it. Let's still take your time, but let's go. The next
There was news that he was working more on it since the quarantine started.
Working more on it, like he's starting to he's held up in his house. He's just kind of staring at the computer, being like, I could write that. I can't go on any more press tours. Let's see. So that's
George taking some heat too.
Let's go with the Winds of Winter. I'm ready.
Patterson and George. Charles, you're gonna make enemies of two of the biggest authors in the world.
I love George Martin, man. I'm a huge fan. I'm a big fan. I'm just ready. I think the world is ready. So
Did you just call him George Martin? Put some respect on his name.
I know.
Throw those R's in.
All these famous fantasy authors with the R's in the middle, You have the Harry Potter. No. Rowling doesn't have
J.K. Rowling.
She's got an R in the last name, but not in the middle. You have Tolkien.
That wasn't a choice.
You have Tolkien. Yeah, he's got the R.
J.R.R. Tolkien. Yeah.
And George. If I were to ever write a fantasy book, I'd throw some R's in there for sure.
Would you?
Oh,
my middle name's actually got an R, so
yeah,
I feel
so you're
like
already
I'd be justified.
Set. But authors tend to develop the pen names, so mine would definitely be my name, but I would put RR in the middle just because I feel like it will help sell books.
Charles R.R. McLaughlin.
Yes, that would be it.
I gotta get your last name out there.
The other thing I'm looking forward to As everyone knows, I'm a big Lord of the Rings fanboy, and the series, it will come to Amazon eventually, and I'm very excited for that. I have no idea what it's going to be about. All the news is out there, but I'm excited for that. Same thing with the Wheel of Time on Amazon. They're really trying to find that next Game of Thrones series, and I'm excited. I hope they do all the fantasy series, all the fantasy books get TV shows. I would be very interested in watching it. So Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings on Amazon, big ones. And these Mistborn movies that are supposedly happening that may never happen, but hey, I'm ready. I'm rereading the series in preparation for our next episode, and I'm really digging it. I think it would be perfect for the show to see those movies. So looking forward to that, and that's the top of the list, man. Those are kind of my looking forward to. It's a lot of TV, but I'm a big TV guy.
Yeah, that's the Wheel of Time is definitely on mine. I've never read the book, so
It's good.
I was thinking of saying even reading Wheel of Time as something I was looking forward to. But, one gigantic series at a time. I'm not going to double up Wheel of Time and Malazan.
But I enjoyed Malazan. I really did.
You're backtracking now.
I enjoyed Wheel of Time. We're nearing the end of my attention span here. So yes, I enjoyed Wheel of Time. Malazan I gave up on, but I will go back to it. I had to table it. It was too much. But I'm ready for more Wheel of Time, and the show should be good. So I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I think if we're doing a looking forward to it section of this podcast, then
we are.
I'll have to be the one. We're doing it. Yeah, we're already deep in it.
Yeah.
I have to be the one then to say Doors of Stone, which is the third book of the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss.
I haven't started it yet. I'm waiting for that to come out because I know I'm just gonna burn through them. I don't want to have this gap. I want them all fresh. I want to read 1, then 2, then 3. So I've been waiting for that to come out for a long time. So.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely great books, and I'm far from the first person to say that. I think he's got I find it to be the best prose in the genre, and he's one that I definitely do find myself when I'm reading it. I'm like, oh wow, that is an amazing turn of phrase, and they're good stuff. Patrick Rothfuss has taken a lot of heat for how long it's taken for this third book. I'm not going to load onto that right now. I'll just say that I look forward to it when it does come out.
Look, it can't be easy to be doing all, and that's a couple fantasy authors kind of are like that, but I feel like it's unfair to be demanding of having them stick to a release schedule. And we're talking about these epic stories with lots of threads to them. Like, I'll wait, but that's a good one. I'm glad you said that because I haven't read any of those books yet. I've been waiting eagerly because that's kind of my philosophy on fantasy. I prefer to read ones that the end is in sight so that I don't get to that point and then have to wait years and forget about it and stuff. So I just get more out of it when everything's fresh in my brain. So I've been just kind of holding because it was like I feel like that was supposed to come out so many years ago when I was looking it up, and I was like, I'm gonna read this when it comes out. It's like, oh, it's gonna come out soon, and it never happens. But
yeah, it's a tough one. I'll definitely have to reread. I think it'll have been enough time for me where I think I need a little time between rereading, where I'll really enjoy and have forgotten a lot of stuff. So
it'll be a great time to reread it for the show. Yes. We have a good reason to go back and revisit all of these series as they become relevant in the world.
Yeah, well, I'm excited for a lot of. I think that'll be interesting. We're both rereading Mistborn now for preparing for our upcoming episode, and
that's right.
It'll be, both of us reflecting on a book we know we both already like. So I think that something that'll be really interesting is when we start getting to some stuff that either neither of us have read, or one of us has read and the other hasn't, so you get to kind of
Right, stuff
see
we haven't
the other
actually
person
talked
go
about
through it.
before. So
Yeah.
fresh conversations will be really exciting because the ones we both read, we've talked to death, but it will be interesting to look at it on the reread for some of these, like Mistborn.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for those of you that have listened. This has been the first episode. How you feeling, buddy?
I feel great.
I think this went good. I mean, it's on the longer side, but it's good. And you know what? For a first episode, it could have been a whole lot worse.
Yeah, I thought flowed pretty smoothly. I think it was easy to fall back into some sort of natural rhythm of talking to my friend about fantasy.
That's right. Nothing quite like friends talking fantasy together.
There's nothing like it.
Nothing quite like it. And I'm fortunate that we were able to share this moment together. And I feel fortunate that we were able to share this moment with you, the listener. So that is episode 1, getting in the books.
It's in the books.
In the books. We're going to go
Put
ahead
it in
and get some outro music.
Oh,
cranking.
yeah.
What'd you guys think of that intro music? Did you like it?
Put it in the comment section that doesn't exist.
Put it in the comment section. I really like the intro music. It took us a long time to find that.
Yeah.
So
That's good stuff.
You know, it's a good tone. And now the outro music is also good. So that's it. That's episode 1.
Yeah.
In the books.
Are you gonna do? You were gonna have a catchphrase at the end, Charles.
Oh yes. All right. Episode 1 in the books. Thank you for listening. And go forth and conquer. Conquer the world. Go forth and conquer. That's the catchphrase.
Nailed it.
Nailed it. Good. Let's make that stick.
Very smooth.
On with the show. Go forth and conquer, friends. And tune in for when we talk about Mistborn. You don't want to miss it. So long.
See ya.
Bye.
All right, now that they're gone, turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turn it up. It's about as loud as it gets.
Oh yeah.
Good.
Going forth and conquering.
Go forth and conquer. I think that's good.
I think, yeah. Dun, 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 dun.
How about that outro music? That's good stuff.
Panda power, baby.
It's called Panda Power. That's the real title. Okay.
Oh.
A little reprieve. Okay, that's enough of that.
We did it. Yeah. No, I'm gonna stop recording now.